The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on April 24th, 2019. After 23 years on the Calgary Police Service, I thought I'd heard all. But the voice on the other end of the line, Kim Lovett, would haunt me for months to come. Her daughter Jasmine and granddaughter Aliyah had vanished without a trace, and everything in my gut told me this wasn't going. Knocking firmly on the door. We need to speak with Robert Leeming regarding a missing persons report. Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. Mr. Leeming, we know you're home. We just need to ask you a few questions about Jasmine Lovett and Aliyah Sanderson. Still nothing. Walsh and I exchanged glances. We could hear movement inside, the creak of floorboards, the muffled sound of what might have been a television being turned down. Someone was definitely home, but they weren't answering. Sir, we're not going anywhere, I called out. We can wait here all night if necessary, but we will speak with you about the whereabouts of Jasmine and Aliyah. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the distinct sound of multiple locks being disengaged. The door opened just wide enough to reveal a man's face, pale, unshaven, with bloodshot eyes that darted nervously between Walsh and me. Robert Leeming? I asked. Yeah, that's me, he replied, his voice thick with what I immediately recognized as the combined effects of alcohol and marijuana. The sweet, skunky smell wafted from the house like a physical presence. We need to talk to you about Jasmine Lovett and her daughter Aliyah. Their family has reported them missing. Robert's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the concern or confusion I would expect from someone whose girlfriend and her child had disappeared, he seemed almost relieved, as if he'd been expecting this conversation but dreading at the same time. She's with her sister, he said quickly, too quickly. That's where she is. With her sister. I felt the first red flag go up in my mind. Kim Lovett had been very clear. Jasmine wasn't with her sister Genevieve. In fact, Genevieve had been calling and texting Jasmine for days with no response. Mr. Leeming, that doesn't make sense, Walsh interjected. The family has been trying to reach Jasmine for days. Her sister hasn't heard from her either. Robert swayed slightly, gripping the doorframe for support. Well, I don't know where she is then. She threatened to move out a few weeks ago. We got into a fight, and she threw some of my stuff around. Maybe she just left. The story was already changing, and we've been talking for less than 2 minutes. I made a mental note to document every inconsistency. When did you last see Jasmine and Aliyah? I asked. April 18th, he said without hesitation. We went for a picnic near Bragg Creek. Had some beers, chilled out, came back home. Next day, I went somewhere else. And when I came back, they weren't here. Another red flag. If he'd gone somewhere else, and they weren't there when he returned, why hadn't he called someone? Why hadn't he been concerned enough to reach out to Jasmine's family?
How's it going?
Says she's with her sister.
Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right. Well, we're just going to take a quick look around. We need to have a look.
So, sorry, you're Robert? Okay. We've been here for hours and hours and hours now, hey? Banging on your door.
I've been drinking, smoking a lot, so.
No, I'll have to phone Mom and start digging, but that doesn't jive.
What's this phone wrap for?
Just privacy.
Huh? Privacy. Did you see the note on the door?
I did now.
Okay. I'm gonna go make the call to Mom.
Even through the grainy body cam footage, Robert's intoxication was evident. But more concerning was his complete lack of appropriate emotional response. Here was a man whose girlfriend and her toddler had been missing for nearly a week, and he seemed more annoyed by our presence than worried about their safety. As we wrapped up that initial contact, I knew we needed to dig deeper into Robert Leeming's background. Something about his demeanor, his contradictory statements, and his obvious substance abuse painted a picture of a man with secrets. Dark secrets. The next morning, I began what would become the most intensive background investigation of my career. Robert Leeming's history read like a textbook case study in escalating antisocial behavior. Born on a British military base in Germany to a career officer, he'd spent his early childhood in England before his family settled in the small town of Marlborough, Wiltshire. On paper, it seemed like a normal, even privileged upbringing. But as I dug deeper, disturbing patterns began to emerge. The first red flag came from a police report filed when Robert was just 7 years old. A neighbor had called authorities after witnessing the boy torturing a cat in his backyard. When questioned, Robert showed no remorse, claiming he was just playing with the animal. More troubling still, his parents had allowed him to begin collecting knives at this same age, a collection that would grow to over 60 blades by the time he reached adulthood. I spent hours on the phone with Wiltshire police, piecing together Robert's early life. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, who had worked several cases involving the Leeming family over the years, painted a picture of a deeply troubled child. The boy was odd, Detective Morrison, she told me during one of our lengthy transatlantic calls. Not just the knives, though that was concerning enough. He had this way of looking at you, like he was cataloging your weaknesses, planning something. His brothers were normal lads, but Robert, there was something off about him from the start. The pattern continued into adolescence. School reports described him as intelligent but withdrawn, with a tendency toward violent outbursts when frustrated. Teachers noted his fascination with death and violence, often incorporating disturbing imagery into his art projects and creative writing assignments. But it was in his early 20s that Robert's behavior truly began to escalate. In 2007, while working as a heavy machinery mechanic in England, he met Sarah Thompson, a young teacher from Calgary, through an online dating site. Their courtship was conducted entirely through the internet and phone calls, a relationship that existed in the digital realm for over 2 years before they met in person. Sarah later told me that Robert had been charming during their long-distance relationship, painting himself as a romantic figure willing to cross an ocean for love. He knew exactly what to say, she recalled during one of our interviews. He made me feel special, like I was the only woman in the world. It wasn't until after we were married that I saw his true nature. The immigration record showed that Robert had indeed applied for Canadian permanent residency, citing his relationship with Sarah as the primary reason. Heavy machinery mechanics were in high demand in Alberta's booming oil industry, making his application relatively straightforward. By 2013, he had obtained his permanent resident status and married Sarah in a small ceremony in Calgary. For a brief period, it seemed like Robert might have found stability. He and Sarah purchased a townhouse in the new development of Cranston, adopted a dog named Axel, and welcomed a son in 2014. From the outside, they appeared to be a typical young family, building a life together in suburban Calgary. But behind closed doors, the same patterns that had marked Robert's entire life were reasserting themselves. The respondent had been emotionally abusing the petitioner throughout the years of marriage. The respondent told the petitioner, "I was crazy," told the petitioner, "I was nuts," called the petitioner useless and worthless, and told the petitioner I needed psychiatric help. The respondent also claimed that the petitioner had ruined his life by having a baby he didn't want, a dog he didn't care for, and giving him a life that he didn't desire to continue. The respondent saw every shortcoming and drawback in his life to be the petitioner's fault. The divorce documents painted a harrowing picture of psychological abuse and manipulation. Sarah had endured years of verbal and emotional torture, with Robert systematically undermining her self-worth and mental health. But the most chilling detail emerged from the custody hearing transcripts. According to Sarah's testimony, Robert had taken their family dog, Axel, to the mountains under the pretense of a hiking trip. Instead, he had tied the animal to a tree with no food or water and left it to die. Only the intervention of other hikers had saved the dog's life. But the incident had left Sarah terrified of what her husband might be capable of. The judge in the custody case had been equally disturbed by Robert's behavior. In his ruling, he noted that Robert could only see his son under strict supervision, citing credible concerns about the respondent's mental state and potential for violence. The no-contact order between Robert and Sarah was absolute. He was forbidden from approaching her home, workplace, or any location where she might be present. As I read through the case files, I couldn't help but think about Jasmine Lovett. Had she known about Robert's history when she began dating him? Had she understood the kind of man she was getting involved with? The answer, I would soon discover, was no. Robert had expertly crafted a new identity for himself, presenting himself as a lonely but harmless divorced father looking for companionship. He had hidden his violent past, his substance abuse, and his increasingly erratic behavior behind a facade of wounded vulnerability. Jasmine Lovett's story broke my heart from the very beginning. At 24, she was a single mother trying to build a life for herself and her daughter Aliyah in a city that could be unforgiving to young women without family support. She worked multiple part-time jobs, retail during the day, cleaning offices at night, just to make ends meet. According to her sister Genevieve, Jasmine had been reluctant to start dating again after her relationship with Aliyah's father ended. She was scared, Genevieve told me during one of her early interviews. She'd been hurt before, and she was protective of Aliyah. She didn't want to bring someone into their lives who might not have their best interests at heart. But loneliness and the natural human desire for companionship eventually led Jasmine to download several dating apps. She was careful, Genevieve assured me, always meeting potential partners in public places and never introducing them to Aliyah unless she was confident about the relationship's future. Robert Leeming had appeared on her screen in March 2019, just over a month before her disappearance. His profile painted him as a successful mechanic and devoted father, recently divorced, and looking for someone to share his life with. The photos showed a reasonably attractive man in his 30s, always smiling, often posed with what appeared to be his son. What Jasmine couldn't have known was that Robert had carefully curated his online presence to hide his true nature. The photos were old, taken during happier times in his marriage to Sarah. The description of himself as a devoted father conveniently omitted the fact that he was only allowed supervised visits with his son, and the claim of being a successful mechanic ignored his pattern of job hopping due to theft allegations and workplace conflicts. Their early conversations, which I was able to recover from Jasmine's phone records, showed Robert at his most manipulative. He was attentive, asking about her day, her dreams, her fears. He expressed understanding about the challenges of single parenthood, claiming to struggle with similar issues after his divorce. He was patient, never pushing for physical intimacy or trying to rush the relationship. In other words, he was everything that Jasmine's previous relationship had lacked: stable, supportive, and understanding. He seemed too good to be true, Genevieve told me, tears streaming down her face. And I guess he was. But Jasmine was so happy in those first few weeks. She would text me about how kind he was, how he listened to her, how he made her feel valued. She thought she'd finally found someone who would be good for both her and Aliyah. The relationship progressed quickly, which should have been another red flag. Within 2 weeks of their first date, Robert was suggesting that they spend more time together. Within a month, he was offering to let Jasmine and Aliyah move in with him, ostensibly to help with her housing costs. I've seen this pattern before: predators who identify vulnerable targets and then quickly work to isolate them from their support systems. By getting Jasmine to move in with him, Robert was separating her from her family and friends, making her more dependent on him both financially and emotionally. But Jasmine, desperate for stability and genuinely caring about this man who seemed to care about her, saw only the positive aspects of his offer. She was tired of struggling to pay rent on her small apartment. She was exhausted from working multiple jobs while trying to care for a toddler. Robert's offer seemed like the answer to her prayers. She moved into his Cranston townhouse on April 1st, 2019. 3 weeks later, she and Aliyah would be dead. Robert, March 15th, 2019, 10:23 p.m. How was your day? I hope work wasn't too stressful. Jasmine, March 15th, 2019, 10:47 p.m. Long day, but okay. Aliyah was cranky. I think she's getting another tooth. How about you? Robert, March 15th, 2019, 10:52 p.m. I remember those days with my son. The teething phase is rough, but it passes. Have you tried frozen washcloths? Sometimes that helps with the pain. Jasmine, March 15th, 2019, 11:15 p.m. I haven't tried that. Thank you for the suggestion. It's nice to talk to someone who understands. Robert, March 15th, 2019, 11:18 p.m. Single parenting is the hardest job in the world. You're doing an amazing job, even when it doesn't feel like it. Reading through those early conversations was like watching a master manipulator at work. Robert had identified exactly what Jasmine needed to hear: validation, understanding, support, and he had delivered it with surgical precision. Every message was calculated to build trust and dependency. But as the relationship progressed beyond the initial honeymoon phase, the real Robert Leeming began to emerge. According to text messages I recovered from both phones, Robert had re-downloaded multiple dating apps within 2 weeks of Jasmine moving in. He was actively messaging other women, arranging dates, and lying about his relationship status. When Jasmine discovered some of these messages, she confronted him. The argument that followed, based on text exchanges between Jasmine and her sister, was explosive. Robert had denied the cheating, claiming the messages were old or that the women were just friends. But Jasmine wasn't naive. She knew what she was seeing, and she threatened to move out. I can't do this again, she had texted Genevieve on April 10th. I thought he was different, but he's just like all the others. I need to start looking for a new place. But leaving wasn't as simple as packing her bags. Jasmine had given up her apartment lease, used her savings for the security deposit at Robert's house, and integrated Aliyah into the daily routine of their new living situation. She was, in many ways, trapped, and Robert knew it. The final week of Jasmine and Aliyah's lives was a study in mounting tension and barely contained violence. Through a combination of digital forensics, witness interviews, and security camera footage, I was able to piece together a timeline that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. April 12, 2019. Jasmine sent a series of text messages to her sister expressing frustration with Robert's behavior. "He's drinking more," she wrote, "and he's been acting strange around Aliyah, like he resents her being here." This was the first indication that Robert's antipathy toward children, which had been evident in his treatment of his own son, was extending to Aliyah. April 13th, 2019. Security footage from a local grocery store showed Jasmine shopping alone with Aliyah, looking tired and stressed. The cashier, whom I interviewed weeks later, remembered the interaction because Jasmine had seemed on edge, constantly checking her phone and looking over her shoulder. April 14th, 2019. The family dinner at Kim Lovett's house. The last time anyone outside of Robert's home would see Jasmine and Aliyah alive. According to both Kim and Genevieve, Jasmine had seemed subdued during the visit, while Robert had been overly talkative and animated, as if overcompensating for some underlying tension. Something was off, Kim told me. Jasmine kept watching Robert, like she was monitoring his behavior. And Robert, he was too friendly, too eager to please. It wasn't natural. Genevieve noticed similar behavior. Robert kept interrupting Jasmine, finishing her sentences, speaking for her. It was like he was controlling the conversation, making sure she didn't say anything he didn't want her to say. Most tellingly, when the family discussed plans for the following week, Jasmine had been non-committal about future gatherings. "I'm not sure what our schedule will be like," she had said, avoiding eye contact with her mother and sister. In hindsight, this seemed like a woman who knew her situation was precarious, but wasn't sure how to communicate that to her family. April 15th, 2019. The last confirmed sighting of Jasmine and Aliyah outside of Robert's home. Security footage from a Walmart showed them shopping together in the early afternoon. Jasmine appeared to be stocking up on groceries and household supplies. Behavior consistent with someone planning to leave or preparing for an extended period at home. The cashier who served them, Maria Santos, provided crucial testimony during the later investigation. "The little girl was fussy," she recalled. "The mom looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept. But what I remember most was how she kept checking her phone, like she was waiting for something or worried about something." April 16th, 2019. This was the day that would change everything, though we wouldn't learn the full details until months later. According to Robert's eventual confession, this was when Aliyah died, allegedly from a fall down the stairs while in his care. It was also when Jasmine's fate was sealed. But on that Tuesday, from the outside, everything appeared normal. Robert was spotted at his usual job site, operating heavy machinery for a construction company. Coworkers later described him as being in a good mood, joking and laughing with his colleagues. There was no indication of a horror that had allegedly unfolded at his home the night before. April 17th, 2019, the day Robert claims he disposed of the bodies. Security footage from a gas station showed him filling up his truck and an additional jerry can, far more fuel than would be needed for normal driving. He paid in cash, avoiding the credit card trail that might have made him easier to track. Later that same day, he was captured on surveillance at a cannabis dispensary, purchasing a significant quantity of marijuana. Again, he paid in cash. The bud tender who served him described Robert as jittery and paranoid, constantly looking around the store and speaking in hushed tones. April 18th, 2019. Robert's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was seen at multiple locations around Calgary, seemingly driving aimlessly. Security footage showed him at a car wash, carefully cleaning both the interior and exterior of his vehicle. He also made several trips to dumpsters in different neighborhoods, disposing of bags of unknown contents. Most significantly, he called in sick to work, something that was apparently unusual for him. His supervisor later told investigators that Robert had never missed a day of work without advance notice in the 2 years he'd been employed there. The evening of April 18th was when Robert claimed he had last seen Jasmine and Aliyah alive, telling investigators they had gone on a picnic to Bragg Creek. But analysis of his phone's GPS data showed he had never left the Calgary area that day, and no security cameras in the Bragg Creek area captured his vehicle. April 19th, 2019, the day Jasmine and Aliyah failed to appear for the family dinner at Kim's house. This was also when the first cracks in Robert's facade began to show. Neighbors reported loud music and the sound of what might have been furniture being moved around inside his townhouse. One neighbor, Mrs. Chun, called a non-emergency police line to complain about the noise, but was told it wasn't a priority. I should have insisted they come check, Mrs. Chun told me later, guilt evident in her voice. I knew something wasn't right. The music was too loud, too constant, like someone was trying to cover up other sounds. April 20th to 23rd. The days of mounting concern from Jasmine's family, culminating in Kim's visit to the townhouse and her subsequent decision to file a missing persons report. During this period, Robert's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He was spotted at various liquor stores around the city, always paying cash, always purchasing enough alcohol for several days of heavy drinking. His social media activity also became erratic. He posted several cryptic messages about new beginnings and leaving the past behind, along with song lyrics that seemed to reference death and loss. When friends and acquaintances commented on these posts, asking if he was okay, Robert either ignored them or responded with nonsensical statements. April 24th, 2019, the day we made contact with Robert at his townhouse. By this time, he had been living alone with the knowledge of what he had done for nearly a week. The psychological pressure was evident in his appearance, his behavior, and his inability to maintain a coherent story about Jasmine and Aliyah's whereabouts. But despite all of these red flags, despite the inconsistencies in his story and the obvious signs of his deteriorating mental state, we still didn't have probable cause for an arrest. We needed more evidence, more proof of foul play. What we didn't know was that Robert was about to hand us exactly what we needed. Obtaining a search warrant for Robert Leeming's residence required threading a legal needle. We had suspicions, inconsistencies, and concerning behavior, but we needed to present probable cause to a judge that a crime had been committed and that evidence of that crime could be found in his home. I spent the early morning hours of April 25th crafting the most comprehensive warrant application of my career. Every detail mattered. Robert's contradictory statements, his history of domestic violence, the family's concerns about Jasmine's character and reliability, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the disappearance. The breakthrough came when our digital forensics team managed to extract additional data from Jasmine's phone records. Her device had been pinging cell towers in the Calgary area right up until the evening of April 16th, then went completely silent. This contradicted Robert's claim that she had left voluntarily and was staying with friends or family. More importantly, the last ping from her phone had come from a tower that provided coverage to Robert's immediate neighborhood. If she had left of her own accord, her phone would have continued to ping towers along whatever route she had taken out of the city. Judge Patricia Henley reviewed our application with the thoroughness I'd come to expect from her over the years. She asked pointed questions about the strength of our evidence, the likelihood that a search would reveal additional information, and the potential for the warrant to be challenged on constitutional grounds. "Detective Morrison," she said, looking at me over her reading glasses, "this is a circumstantial case. You're asking me to authorize the search of a man's home based on suspicious behavior and inconsistent statements. That's a high bar to clear." "Your Honor," I replied, "we have a 24-year-old woman and her 22-month-old daughter who have vanished without a trace. The last person to see them alive has given us multiple conflicting stories about their whereabouts. His ex-wife has documented his history of violence and animal cruelty. We believe there's probable cause to believe that evidence of their fate can be found in his residence." Judge Henley studied the application for several more minutes before signing the warrant. "You have 48 hours, Detective. Make them count." The search was scheduled for 1 p.m. that afternoon. I wanted to give Robert as little time as possible to prepare or dispose of evidence, but I also needed to ensure that our tactical team was properly briefed and that all necessary specialists were available. As I drove home to catch a few hours of sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to uncover something terrible. The evidence was pointing toward a double homicide, and everything I knew about Robert Leeming suggested he was capable of extreme violence when cornered. What I didn't anticipate was just how elaborate his preparations had been. The court finds that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the offenses of murder contrary to Section 235 of the Criminal Code of Canada and unlawful confinement contrary to Section 279 of the Criminal Code of Canada, have been committed. There are reasonable grounds to believe that evidence of the said offenses will be found at the premises located at 47 Cranfield Gardens, Calgary, Alberta, being a two-story townhouse with beige stucco exterior and black front door. The search is authorized for a period of 48 hours from the time of issuance. The search may be conducted between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. unless exigent circumstances require otherwise. The tactical team assembled at 12:30 p.m. in the parking lot of a shopping center about half a mile from Robert's townhouse. The team consisted of 8 officers, including 2 specialists in crime scene processing and 1 K-9 unit trained in detecting human remains. Sergeant Walsh would lead the entry team, while I coordinated the overall search and handled any interrogation of Robert. We had discussed the possibility that he might resist arrest or attempt to destroy evidence, so the plan called for a quick, overwhelming show of force. At exactly 1 p.m., the convoy of police vehicles turned onto Cranfield Gardens. The street was quiet, with most residents at work or school. A few curious neighbors peered through their windows as we parked in front of Robert's townhouse. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came when our lead officer, Constable Mike Thompson, tried to push open the front door. It wouldn't budge. Doors barricaded. He called out over his radio, moving to secondary entry point. The back door was unlocked, which struck me as odd given that Robert had clearly taken great care to secure the front entrance. As our team moved through the house, the reason for the barricade became clear. The scene inside Robert's home defied rational explanation. The front door had been barricaded with wooden barge poles, the kind used for construction or moving heavy equipment. Furniture had been piled against the door, creating an obstacle that would have taken considerable time and effort to assemble. But it was the bacon that truly disturbed me. Strips of raw bacon had been placed throughout the house in seemingly random locations. One piece dangled from the back of a dining room chair, like some macabre decoration. Another was found stuffed into the cap of the dry sump system in the furnace room. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" Constable Thompson asked, photographing the bacon in the dining room. I had seen similar behavior in other cases involving suspects with severe mental health issues or those attempting to throw off police dogs. The strong scent of bacon could potentially interfere with a K-9 unit's ability to detect other odors, including the scent of human remains. The master bedroom was secured with a heavy padlock, which required bolt cutters to remove. Inside, we found Robert's extensive collection of knives and several firearms, all legally owned but secured in a locked vault. The number of blades was staggering. Over 60 knives of various sizes and types, from small utility knives to large hunting blades that could easily be used as weapons. But despite the bizarre scene, we found no direct evidence of violence. There were no bloodstains, no signs of a struggle, no obvious indicators that Jasmine and Aliyah had been harmed in the house. The forensics team took hundreds of samples for DNA analysis, but the initial assessment was that the scene had been thoroughly cleaned. Robert was arrested without incident, found passed out in the basement family room surrounded by empty beer bottles and marijuana paraphernalia. His first words upon being roused were, "I knew you'd come back." As he was led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but notice the satisfied smile on his face. It was as if he was relieved that the charade was finally over. Robert Leeming's formal interrogation began at 6:30 p.m. on April 25, 2019. He had been given time to sober up, speak with a lawyer, and understand his rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. By the time Sergeant Walsh and I entered the interview room, he appeared lucid and composed, a stark contrast to the intoxicated man we had arrested earlier that day. The interview room at Calgary Police Service Headquarters is designed to be psychologically unsettling. The walls are beige, the lighting is harsh fluorescent, and the furniture is minimal, just a metal table and 3 uncomfortable chairs. There are no windows, no clocks, and no distractions. The goal is to create an environment where the suspect's only focus is on the conversation at hand. Robert sat calmly in his chair, hands folded in front of him, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit issued to all detainees. His demeanor was different from our previous encounters, more controlled, more calculated. It was as if he had used the time since his arrest to construct a new narrative. "Mr. Leeming," I began, You understand that you're being questioned in relation to the disappearance of Jasmine Lovett and Aliyah Sanderson? Yes, he replied simply. And you understand that you have the right to remain silent, and that anything you say can be used as evidence against you? Yes. Good. Let's start with the last time you saw Jasmine and Aliyah. You previously told officers that you last saw them on April 18th during a picnic at Bragg Creek. Is that correct? Robert paused, his eyes darting between Walsh and me. I may have been confused about the dates. I was drinking heavily during that period, and the days kind of blur together. Another inconsistency. He was already backing away from his previous statement, which suggested he was trying to align his story with evidence he thought we might have discovered. Okay, so when did you actually last see them? April 16th, I think. We were all home. I was watching Aliyah while Jasmine went out to run some errands. When she came back, we had dinner together, and then they went to bed. And then what happened? Nothing. I went to bed too. When I woke up the next morning, they were gone. Gone how? Did you see them leave? Did they take anything with them? I don't know. I just woke up and they weren't there anymore. This version of events was significantly different from his previous statements. Now he was claiming they had disappeared overnight, rather than during a day trip to Bragg Creek. The inconsistencies were mounting, but I needed to be careful not to reveal how much we actually knew. Mr. Leeming, we've analyzed Jasmine's phone records. Her phone stopped transmitting data on the evening of April 16th. If she left voluntarily, why would she turn off her phone? Robert's composure slipped slightly. He shifted in his chair and broke eye contact for the first time since the interview began. I don't know anything about her phone. Maybe the battery died. Maybe she lost it. I can't speak for what Jasmine did or didn't do. But you were in a relationship with her. You lived together. Wouldn't you be concerned if your girlfriend and her daughter disappeared without explanation? Of course I was concerned. But Jasmine and we weren't getting along very well. She had threatened to leave before. I figured she'd finally made good on her threat. So, you weren't concerned enough to call her family? You didn't think to reach out to her sister or her mother to see if they had heard from her? I didn't want to cause drama. I thought she would contact them herself when she was ready. The interview continued for over 3 hours, with Robert maintaining his innocence, but offering increasingly implausible explanations for his behavior and the evidence we had uncovered. He claimed not to know why his front door had been barricaded. He insisted the bacon found throughout his house was simply food that had been left out and forgotten. He denied knowing anything about Jasmine's whereabouts or the circumstances of her disappearance. But throughout the interview, I noticed subtle signs that suggested Robert knew more than he was revealing. When we discussed specific dates, he would sometimes pause and appear to be calculating something in his head. When we mentioned physical evidence, he would unconsciously touch his face or adjust his clothing, classic signs of deception. Most tellingly, when we discussed Aliyah specifically, Robert's entire demeanor would change. His voice would become colder, his posture more rigid. It was clear that he had significantly more negative feelings toward the child than toward Jasmine. Mr. Leeming, I said as the interview was winding down, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about Jasmine and Aliyah? Anything that might help us understand what happened to them? Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring at the table. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes that I had never seen before, a kind of cold calculation that made my skin crawl. No, he said simply. I've told you everything I know. But I knew he was lying. The question was whether we would be able to prove it. Detective Morrison, Mr. Leeming, we found some unusual items in your home. Can you explain why there were strips of bacon placed throughout the house? Robert Leeming, I don't know what you're talking about. Detective Morrison, we found bacon hanging from furniture, bacon in your furnace room. That's not normal behavior, Mr. Leeming. Robert Leeming, maybe I was drunk and left food lying around. I don't remember everything I did during that time. Sergeant Walsh, what about the barricade on your front door? Why was your door blocked with wooden poles and furniture? Robert Leeming, I was scared. I thought someone might try to break in. Detective Morrison, scared of what? Who did you think was going to break in? Robert Leeming, I don't know. I was paranoid. I was drinking a lot, smoking a lot of weed. Sometimes you get paranoid when you're using substances. Sergeant Walsh, Mr. Leeming, Jasmine's family is very worried about her. She's never gone this long without contacting them. Don't you think that's strange? Robert Leeming, I don't know what's normal for Jasmine. Maybe she just needed space. After the interrogation, I felt more certain than ever that Robert was responsible for Jasmine and Aliyah's disappearance. But feeling certain and being able to prove it in court are two very different things. We had circumstantial evidence, suspicious behavior, and inconsistent statements, but we still lacked the physical evidence necessary for a conviction. The forensics team was working around the clock to process the samples collected from Robert's home, but DNA analysis takes time. Blood spatter analysis takes time. Toxicology reports take time. And with each passing day, the pressure to either charge Robert or release him was mounting. Under Canadian law, we could hold him for 24 hours without charges. After that, we would need to either formally charge him with a crime or let him go. The clock was ticking, and we were running out of options. That's when I made the decision that would ultimately break the case wide open. The idea for Operation Highwood came to me during a sleepless night 2 weeks after Robert's release. We had been forced to let him go after 24 hours, lacking sufficient evidence to file charges. The forensics results from his home had been inconclusive, trace amounts of blood that could have come from any number of sources, DNA evidence that proved only that Jasmine and Aliyah had lived there, and no definitive proof of violence or foul play. But I knew Robert was guilty. Every instinct I had developed over 2 decades of police work told me that this man had killed Jasmine and Aliyah, and that he was going to get away with it unless we found a way to make him confess. Operation Highwood was named after the area where we suspected the bodies might be hidden, the foothills and forests west of Calgary, where thousands of acres of wilderness could conceal evidence indefinitely. The operation was ambitious, expensive, and risky, but it was our best chance of getting the truth. The concept was simple. Undercover officers would approach Robert and pose as criminals who had witnessed his suspicious behavior. They would claim to have found evidence that could implicate him in the disappearances, then offer to help him cover up his crimes in exchange for money or other considerations. The goal was to get Robert to admit his guilt while being recorded. These types of undercover operations, known as Mr. Big Stings in Canadian law enforcement, are controversial and legally complex. They require extensive judicial oversight and must be conducted within strict ethical guidelines to avoid entrapment. The evidence obtained through such operations is admissible in court, but only if the operation is conducted properly and the suspect's rights are protected throughout. Detective Constable Sarah Kim suspected killers. They would pose as a criminal couple who specialized in disposing of evidence and had connections to organized crime figures who could help Robert if he cooperated. The operation began on May 15, 2019, 3 weeks after Robert's release from custody. Kim and Rodriguez had been conducting surveillance on Robert for several days, learning his routines, his hangouts, and his behavioral patterns. They knew he was drinking heavily at a bar called Murphy's Pub most nights, often staying until closing time and stumbling home visibly intoxicated. The initial contact was planned to seem completely random. Kim and Rodriguez would be at Murphy's Pub when Robert arrived, engage in a conversation about police harassment and the unfairness of the justice system. They would gradually draw Robert into their conversation, expressing sympathy for his situation and hinting that they might be able to help him with his problem. From the observation post I had established in a van across the street from Murphy's Pub, I watched as Kim and Rodriguez executed their plan flawlessly. Robert was clearly intoxicated when he stumbled into the bar around 9:30 p.m., and he was immediately drawn to the couple's loud complaints about police interference in their lives.
You've heard and seen what entrapment is, really?
Detective Kim We don't much like cops either. Buy you a drink, friend. Looks like you could use one.
What are we looking for? Them? Yeah.
The initial contact went better than we had hoped. Robert was immediately receptive to Kim and Rodriguez, seeing them as kindred spirits who understood his persecution at the hands of law enforcement. Over the course of several hours, he gradually opened up about his situation, though he continued to maintain his innocence regarding Jasmine and Aliyah's disappearance. But as the evening wore on and Robert consumed more alcohol, his story began to change. Small details shifted. His timeline became less consistent. Most importantly, he began expressing anger toward Jasmine and, especially, toward Aliyah. That kid was always crying, he slurred at one point. Always needing something, always getting in the way. I couldn't even watch TV without her making noise. Kim and Rodriguez exchanged glances. This was the first time Robert had expressed openly negative feelings about the victims, and it suggested that his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. The evening ended with Robert agreeing to meet his new friends again the following night. He seemed eager to continue the relationship, perhaps desperate for human contact after weeks of isolation and suspicion from his neighbors and co-workers. Over the next 2 weeks, Kim and Rodriguez met with Robert regularly, gradually building trust and drawing him deeper into their fictional criminal world. They claimed to be involved in various illegal activities, drug trafficking, money laundering, evidence disposal, and suggested that they had connections who could help people in Robert's situation. The breakthrough came on May 28th, when Rodriguez told Robert that he had heard through criminal contacts that someone had found a bag of evidence related to the Jasmine Lovett case. The evidence, Rodriguez claimed, could potentially implicate Robert in the disappearance if it fell into the wrong hands. Robert's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of confusion or concern, he displayed knowledge of what this evidence might contain and fear about what it might prove. He didn't ask what was in the bag or why it would implicate him, questions that an innocent person would certainly ask. Instead, he asked where the bag had been found and whether the person who found it could be trusted to keep quiet. "This is bad," he told Rodriguez. "This is really fucking bad. I need to see this bag. I need to know what's in it." Rodriguez suggested that they meet at Robert's workplace the next day, somewhere private where they could discuss the situation without being overheard. Robert agreed immediately, and we knew we were close to a breakthrough. May 29th, 2019, dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seems to seep into your bones. I had been awake since 4 a.m., reviewing the operation plan one final time and coordinating with the surveillance teams that would be monitoring Robert's workplace. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the construction site where Robert worked as a heavy equipment operator. It was an ideal location for our purposes, isolated enough to avoid civilian interference, but with sufficient vantage points for our surveillance teams to maintain visual and audio contact with our undercover officers. Kim and Rodriguez arrived at the site first, positioning themselves near a trailer that served as the construction office. They were equipped with state-of-the-art recording devices, including backup audio systems and GPS trackers that would allow us to follow their movements if the conversation moved to a different location. Robert arrived exactly on time, driving his pickup truck and looking more nervous than we had seen him during any of his previous interactions with our undercover team. He approached Kim and Rodriguez cautiously, constantly scanning the area as if he expected to be watched. "Did you bring it?" were his first words. "The bag you were talking about." "Relax," Rodriguez replied. "Let's talk first. My friend wants to know more about your situation before he decides whether to help you." What followed was a 4.5-hour conversation that would ultimately result in Robert's conviction for murder. Speaking in hushed tones, constantly checking over his shoulder, he gradually revealed the truth about what had happened to Jasmine and Aliyah. The confession came in pieces, with Robert initially trying to minimize his involvement and blame circumstances beyond his control. But as Kim and Rodriguez pressed him for details, the full scope of his crimes became clear. Robert Leeming: "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was an accident. The kid, she fell down the stairs. I was watching her while Jasmine was out, and she just fell." Detective Rodriguez, undercover: "Okay, so the kid had an accident. What about the mother?" Robert Leeming: "That's where it gets complicated. When Jasmine came home and found Aliyah, she went crazy. started screaming at me, blaming me, saying she was going to call the police. Detective Kim, undercover, so what did you do? Robert Leeming. I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. She was hysterical. I grabbed a hammer from the kitchen just to defend myself, and I hit her in the back of the head. Detective Rodriguez, undercover, she died. Robert Leeming. No, not right away. She was on the floor, bleeding, but still breathing. I panicked. I ran upstairs and got one of my guns. I shot her in the head to put her out of her misery. Detective Kim, undercover, Jesus Christ, man. Where are they now? Robert Leeming. I buried them, both of them, wrapped them in a moving blanket and buried them in the woods. Detective Rodriguez, undercover, where? Robert Leeming. I can show you, but I need to know that you're going to help me. I need to know that this bag of evidence is going to disappear. Listening to Robert's confession through my earpiece, I felt a mixture of relief and revulsion. Relief that we finally had the truth, and revulsion at the casual way he described the murder of a young woman and her toddler. There was no remorse in his voice, no indication that he understood the magnitude of what he had done. The conversation continued for several more hours, with Robert providing increasingly detailed accounts of the murders and the disposal of the bodies. He described cleaning the crime scene with bleach, disposing of bloody clothing and other evidence in dumpsters around the city, and using gasoline to accelerate the decomposition of the bodies. Most chillingly, he revealed that he had actually enjoyed the process of covering up his crimes, describing it as like a puzzle that he had to solve. He took pride in his ability to deceive the police and the media, and he seemed to view the entire situation as a game that he was winning. At 6:30 p.m., Rodriguez suggested that Robert show them where the bodies were buried. My guy needs to see the site, he explained. He needs to know what he's dealing with before he can help you. Robert agreed without hesitation. He was so confident in his new criminal allies that he was willing to take them directly to the evidence that would convict him of murder. The drive to the burial site took approximately 90 minutes, winding through the foothills west of Calgary into the wilderness area known as Kananaskis Country. Robert led the way in his pickup truck, followed by Kim and Rodriguez in their undercover vehicle, with multiple surveillance teams maintaining a discreet distance. The location Robert chose was remote and isolated, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that was probably used by hunters and hikers during certain seasons. It was the kind of place where bodies could remain hidden for years, possibly forever, if not for Robert's need to confess his crimes to people he thought were fellow criminals. At approximately 8:15 p.m., Robert's vehicle stopped at a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. He got out of his truck and walked directly to a spot between several large trees, where he stopped and pointed to the ground. Right here, he said. You're looking at it. Kim and Rodriguez approached the location Robert had indicated. Beneath a thin layer of decomposing leaves and branches, they could see the edge of a blue blanket. At that moment, I gave the signal for the arrest teams to move in. Detective Morrison, Robert Leeming, you are under arrest for the murders of Jasmine Lovett and Aliyah Sanderson. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to speak to a lawyer immediately and to have a lawyer present during questioning. Robert Leeming, you gotta be kidding me. You fucking set me up. Detective Morrison, you have the right to contact a lawyer immediately. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them to you? Robert Leeming, I want a lawyer. I'm not saying anything else without a lawyer. The arrest of Robert Leeming marked the end of Operation Highwood, but it was just the beginning of the legal process that would ultimately bring justice for Jasmine and Aliyah. The evidence we had gathered, the recorded confession, the location of the bodies, the physical evidence from the burial site, would form the foundation of the prosecution's case. But even as Robert was being led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but think about the two victims whose lives he had so callously ended. Jasmine Lovett had been a young woman trying to build a better life for herself and her daughter. Aliyah Sanderson had been a toddler who would never have the chance to grow up, to experience the world, to become the person she might have been. Their deaths were not just crimes against them as individuals, but crimes against everyone who loved them and everyone who might have been touched by their lives in the years to come. Robert Leeming had not just taken two lives. He had stolen an entire future. The excavation of the burial site began at dawn on May 30th, 2019. Dr. Margaret Shun, Alberta's chief forensic anthropologist, led a team of specialists who would carefully extract and examine the remains of Jasmine and Aliyah. The process was painstaking and methodical, designed to preserve every piece of potential evidence while treating the victims with the dignity they deserved. I had seen many crime scenes during my career, but few had affected me as deeply as that shallow grave in the Kananaskis wilderness. The blue moving blanket that Robert had used to wrap the bodies was still largely intact, though it had been stained by decomposition fluids and discolored by exposure to the elements. Dr. Chen's initial examination revealed that Robert's confession had been largely accurate, though his attempts to portray the crimes as less premeditated than they actually were would be contradicted by the physical evidence. Aliyah's remains showed clear signs of blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object or suffering a severe fall. However, the fracture patterns suggested that the injuries were more severe than would typically result from a simple fall downstairs. The angle and location of the fractures indicated that she had been struck from above, possibly while lying on the ground. This child didn't just fall down the stairs, Dr. Chen told me as she examined the small skull under a magnifying glass. The trauma pattern suggests she was struck repeatedly with significant force. This was not an accident. Jasmine's remains told an even more disturbing story. The initial blow to the back of her head, the hammer strike Robert had described, had fractured her skull, but would not necessarily have been fatal. She could have survived that injury with proper medical treatment. The gunshot wound to her head, however, was execution style, fired from close range while she was likely lying on the ground. The bullet had entered behind her left ear and exited through her right temple, indicating that Robert had stood over her and fired downward. This woman was murdered while she was already incapacitated, Dr. Chen explained. The gunshot wound is consistent with someone finishing off a victim who was no longer a threat. The physical evidence from the burial site also revealed details about Robert's disposal method that he had not mentioned in his confession. Both bodies had been doused with gasoline in an apparent attempt to accelerate decomposition, and the soil around the grave showed elevated levels of petroleum products. More significantly, trace evidence found on the bodies and in the soil included fibers from Robert's clothing, DNA evidence linking him to the scene, and tool marks on the bones that matched implements found in his home. The case against him was becoming overwhelming, but the most damning evidence came from Robert's own digital footprint. Analysis of his internet search history revealed that he had been researching body disposal methods, soil chemistry, and decomposition rates for several weeks prior to the murders. He had also searched for information about police investigative techniques and ways to avoid detection. Examination of the remains recovered from the Kananaskis burial site reveals the following. Victim 1, Aliyah Sanderson, 22 months. Multiple skull fractures consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Fracture patterns inconsistent with accidental fall. Estimated time of death, April 16th to 17th, 2019. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. Victim 2, Jasmine Lovett, 24 years. Skull fracture to occipital region consistent with blunt force trauma. Gunshot wound ahead, entry point behind left ear. Powder burns indicate close-range firing. Estimated time of death, April 16th to 17th, 2019. Cause of death, gunshot wound to the head. Additional findings. Both victims wrapped in blue moving blanket. Presence of petroleum products, gasoline, on remains and in soil. Trace evidence including fibers, hair, and DNA consistent with suspect. Tool marks on skeletal remains consistent with implements recovered from suspect's residence. The forensic evidence painted a clear picture of premeditated murder, but the prosecution would also need to establish motive. Why had Robert Leeming killed Jasmine and Aliyah? What had driven him to such extreme violence? The answer lay in the psychological profile that emerged from interviews with his ex-wife, former colleagues, and mental health professionals who had evaluated him during previous legal proceedings. Robert Leeming was a classic narcissist with antisocial personality disorder, a man who viewed other people as objects to be manipulated or discarded when they no longer served his purposes. Dr. Sarah Williams, a forensic psychologist who had worked on similar cases, helped me understand Robert's psychological makeup. Men like Robert don't form genuine emotional attachments, she explained. They're capable of mimicking the behaviors associated with love and affection. But underneath, it's all about control and self-gratification. When Jasmine began to assert her independence, questioning his fidelity, threatening to leave, she became a threat to his control. And Aliyah was never anything more than an inconvenience to him. Children require attention, care, and sacrifice, all of which conflict with a narcissist's fundamental selfishness. The psychological evaluation also revealed that Robert had likely been planning to kill Jasmine for some time before he acted. His internet searches, his increasing isolation of her from family and friends, and his pattern of emotional abuse were all consistent with someone building up to violence. The murders weren't crimes of passion, Dr. Williams concluded. They were the inevitable result of a deeply disturbed individual who had reached the point where killing seemed like the easiest solution to his problems. The arrest of Robert Leeming and the discovery of the bodies created a media sensation that would follow the case through its conclusion. The story had all the elements that capture public attention: a manipulative killer, innocent victims, a complex police investigation, and a dramatic conclusion in the wilderness. But the media coverage also presented significant challenges for the investigation and prosecution. Robert's drunken interviews with reporters following his initial release had created a permanent record of his lies and inconsistencies, which would be valuable evidence at trial. However, the intense media scrutiny also made it difficult to conduct follow-up investigations and potentially influence public opinion in ways that could affect jury selection. The most problematic aspect of the media coverage was the comparison between Robert Leeming and Chris Watts, the Colorado man who had murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters in 2018. While there were certainly similarities between the cases, both involved men who killed their families and then lied to the media about their involvement. The comparison oversimplified the unique aspects of Robert's crimes and psychology. The Chris Watts comparison is lazy journalism, explained Dr. Williams. While both men committed family annihilation, their motivations and methods were different. Robert's crimes were more opportunistic and impulsive, while Watts appeared to have planned his murders more extensively. The media attention also had a profound impact on the victims' families. Kim Lovett and Genevieve Lovett were subjected to constant requests for interviews, with reporters camped outside their homes and workplaces. The family ultimately hired a lawyer to handle media requests and issued a statement asking for privacy during their grieving process.
I mean, it's been a whirlwind couple of days, big investigation. What can you tell us about your experience with this in the last 2 days?
Yeah, I can. I was arrested by the tactical team. It's pretty extreme from my experience. Of course, I'd never experienced this before, and they're still investigating.
So, how long were you in police custody?
24 hours, I think.
So, what have you been doing in the meantime?
Just been here.
So, was she living there at the time?
Correct.
Okay, so just so I understand how the situation goes, you own the house.
Correct.
She
Is a tenant.
along
Right.
with Aliyah.
With her daughter, yes, correct.
Okay, so that was the extent of your relationship. She rented from you,
Correct.
and you shared the home.
Correct.
Was there any romantic involvement between the two of you, or is there?
There was initially, but towards the end, no.
How would you characterize your relationship with Jasmine?
Good.
I mean, were you a boyfriend, girlfriend, or?
No, just good friends.
What happens with you right now?
I have no idea. I'm just gonna wait until I get a phone call to say that I can go home.
How are you feeling throughout all of this?
Traumatized, of course.
Is there anything else that you want to add to all this? I mean, we've been asking all these questions, but is there anything that you want to say in addition to all this?
Yeah, if anyone sees her or Aliyah, Jasmine or Aliyah, please, obviously call 911 and let the authorities know. They said that they would be done with the property today. and that I would be able to go back to the property. But
So you're hoping to sleep there tonight?
I'm just curious, you've been very open with the media here today. Why is it that you're choosing to speak to the media?
because I have nothing to hide.
You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide
I still am.
investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. No, we were friends, absolutely friends, and supported each other.
Watching those interviews months later, with the knowledge of what Robert had actually done, was deeply disturbing. His performance was clearly calculated. He used the past tense when speaking about Jasmine, referred to her as was rather than is, and showed no genuine emotion when discussing the possibility that she and Aliyah might be in danger. The interviews also revealed Robert's narcissistic personality in full display. Even while discussing the disappearance of his girlfriend and her child, he managed to make himself the center of attention, focusing on his own trauma and stress rather than expressing concern for the victims. More importantly, the interviews provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. Robert's lies and inconsistencies were captured on video, creating a permanent record that could be used to impeach his credibility if he chose to testify in his own defense. The media coverage would continue throughout the legal proceedings, with reporters covering every court appearance and analyzing every development in the case. While this attention helped keep the victim's story in the public eye, it also created additional pressure on everyone involved in the prosecution. The legal proceedings in the case of Robert Leeming began with his first appearance in provincial court on May 31st, 2019. He was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, reflecting the prosecution's belief that the killings had been planned and deliberate rather than spontaneous acts of violence. First-degree murder charges in Canada carry a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. If convicted on both counts, Robert would face the possibility of consecutive sentences, meaning he could potentially spend 50 years in prison before being eligible for parole. The prosecution team was led by Crown Attorney Jennifer Morrison, no relation to me, despite the shared surname, a veteran prosecutor with extensive experience in complex homicide cases. She would be assisted by Crown Attorney David Shun, who specialized in cases involving domestic violence and family annihilation. Robert's defense team consisted of prominent Calgary criminal defense attorney Michael Thompson and his associate, Sarah Kim. Thompson was known for his aggressive defense tactics and his ability to create reasonable doubt in seemingly hopeless cases. The first major legal battle concerned the admissibility of evidence obtained during Operation Highwood. Thompson filed a motion to exclude Robert's recorded confession, arguing that the undercover operation constituted entrapment and that his client's rights had been violated during the investigation. The hearing on this motion took place over 3 days in September 2019, with extensive testimony from the undercover officers, supervisory personnel, and legal experts on both sides. The defense argued that the police had manipulated Robert into confessing to crimes he might not have committed, while the prosecution maintained that Robert had voluntarily provided information about his own criminal conduct. Judge Patricia Henley, who had also signed the original search warrant for Robert's home, ultimately ruled that the evidence was admissible. In her written decision, she noted that Robert had not been coerced or threatened during the undercover operation, and that he had voluntarily chosen to reveal information about the murders. The accused was not induced to commit a crime, Judge Henley wrote. Rather, he was provided with an opportunity to reveal his involvement in crimes that had already been committed. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Leeming was a willing participant in these conversations, and that he provided detailed information about the murders without any coercion or improper inducement. The ruling was a significant victory for the prosecution, as Robert's confession was the centerpiece of their case. Without it, they would have had to rely primarily on circumstantial evidence, which would have made a conviction much more difficult to obtain. The trial was originally scheduled to begin in January 2020, but was delayed several times due to the COVID-19 pandemic and various pretrial motions. It finally began on September 14, 2021, nearly 2.5 years after the murders. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive, building a narrative that began with Robert's history of violence and manipulation and culminated in the brutal murders of Jasmine and Aliyah. Key witnesses included Kim Lovett and Genevieve Lovett, who testified about Jasmine's character and her relationship with Robert. Sarah Thompson, Robert's ex-wife, who described his pattern of abuse and violence. Dr. Margaret Chun, who explained the forensic evidence and cause of death. The undercover officers who had obtained Robert's confession. Various experts in psychology, ballistics, and digital forensics. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Crown Attorney Morrison, painted a picture of a calculating killer who had murdered 2 innocent people to solve what he saw as a problem in his life. Robert Leeming is a man who sees other people as objects, she told the jury. When Jasmine Lovett and her daughter Aliyah became inconvenient to him, he eliminated them. When they threatened his control over his own life, he chose to end theirs. This case is about a man who believed that his desires were more important than the lives of a young woman and her child. The defense strategy, outlined in Thompson's opening statement, focused on challenging the reliability of Robert's confession and suggesting that the deaths might have been accidental or occurred in self-defense. My client is a troubled man who has struggled with substance abuse and mental health issues, Thompson argued. The confession you will hear was obtained through manipulation and deception from a man who was not in his right mind. The evidence will show that these deaths were tragic accidents, not premeditated murders. However, this strategy faced significant challenges from the beginning. The physical evidence clearly contradicted any theory of accidental death, particularly in Aliyah's case. The forensic evidence showed multiple blunt force trauma injuries that could not have resulted from a simple fall. The trial of Robert Leeming lasted 6 weeks and included testimony from over 40 witnesses. As the lead investigator, I spent 3 days on the witness stand, walking the jury through our investigation from the initial missing persons report to Robert's eventual confession. The most difficult part of my testimony came when I had to describe a crime scene where the bodies were discovered. Looking at the jury, I could see the impact that the evidence was having on them. Several jurors were visibly emotional when Dr. Chun presented her findings about the extent of the victim's injuries. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the presentation of Robert's recorded confession, which was played in its entirety for the jury. Hearing Robert's voice describing the murders in his own words was devastating to the defense's case. His casual tone and lack of remorse made it clear that these were not the words of someone who had accidentally killed 2 people. The defense called several witnesses in an attempt to establish Robert's mental state at the time of the murders, including a psychiatrist who testified that Robert suffered from severe depression and substance abuse disorders. However, the prosecution's rebuttal witnesses, including Dr. Williams, testified that while Robert had mental health issues, he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Perhaps the most damaging testimony for the defense came from Robert himself. Against his lawyer's advice, he chose to testify in his own defense, apparently believing that he could convince the jury of his innocence through his personal charisma. Instead, his testimony revealed the depth of his narcissism and his inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Under cross-examination by Crown Attorney Morrison, Robert continued to blame others for his situation. The police for their investigation, the media for their coverage, and even Jasmine for putting him in this position. Crown Attorney Morrison: Mr. Leeming, you told the undercover officers that you struck Jasmine Lovett in the head with a hammer. Is that true? Robert Leeming: I was confused. I was scared. I said a lot of things that weren't true. Crown Attorney Morrison: but you also led them to the exact location where the bodies were buried. How do you explain that? Robert Leeming: I don't know. Maybe I was guessing. Maybe it was a coincidence. Crown Attorney Morrison: Mr. Leeming, the forensic evidence shows that Aliyah Sanderson was struck multiple times in the head with a blunt object. How do you explain those injuries if she simply fell down the stairs? Robert Leeming: I don't know. Maybe she fell more than once. Maybe she hit her head on something when she fell. Crown Attorney Morrison: and Jasmine Lovett was shot in the head at close range. How do you explain that injury? Robert Leeming: I don't know. I wasn't there when it happened. Crown Attorney Morrison: Mr. Leeming, you confessed to killing both victims. You led police to their bodies. The forensic evidence supports your confession. Are you now claiming that you had nothing to do with their deaths? Robert Leeming. I'm saying that I was confused and scared, and I said things that weren't true. I never killed anyone. Robert's testimony was a disaster for the defense. His attempts to explain away the evidence were unconvincing, and his demeanor on the stand revealed the same narcissistic personality traits that had been evident throughout the investigation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning their verdict. When the foreman announced guilty on both counts of first-degree murder, I felt a sense of relief and closure that I had rarely experienced in my career. Robert showed no visible reaction to the verdict, maintaining the same emotionless expression he had displayed throughout the trial. As he was led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but think about how different this outcome might have been if he had chosen to remain silent instead of confessing his crimes to undercover officers. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later, with victim impact statements from Kim Lovett, Genevieve Lovett, and several other family members and friends. These statements provided a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of Robert's crimes. Your Honor, I stand before you today, not just as a mother who has lost her daughter, but as a grandmother who will never watch her granddaughter grow up. Robert Leeming didn't just take 2 lives that night. He stole Christmas mornings, birthday parties, school graduations, and wedding days. He stole the future that Jasmine was working so hard to build for herself and Aliyah. Jasmine was not perfect, but she was trying. She was working multiple jobs, going to school, and raising her daughter with love and determination. She trusted Robert Leeming to be part of their lives, and he repaid that trust with unspeakable violence. Aliyah was just a baby. She never had the chance to speak her first word, take her first step, or experience any of the joys that childhood should bring. She died afraid and in pain, and that knowledge will haunt me for the rest of my life. I pray that Robert Leeming never has the opportunity to hurt another family the way he has hurt ours. Some people say that everyone deserves a second chance, but some actions are so evil that they cannot be forgiven or forgotten. This is one of those cases. Judge Henley sentenced Robert Leeming to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years on each count of murder, to be served concurrently. While the prosecution had argued for consecutive sentences, which would have meant 50 years before parole eligibility, the judge noted that the murders had occurred during the same incident and therefore did not warrant consecutive sentences. Mr. Leeming, Judge Henley said as she pronounced the sentence, you have been convicted of 2 of the most heinous crimes in our legal system. You murdered a young woman who trusted you and a defenseless child who depended on you for protection. Your actions were calculated, callous, and completely without justification. The evidence presented at trial shows that you are a dangerous individual who poses a significant risk to public safety. While the law requires that I provide you with the possibility of parole after 25 years, I sincerely hope that you will never be released from custody. Robert maintained his innocence even after sentencing, filing an appeal that was ultimately unsuccessful. He remains incarcerated at a maximum security federal prison, where he will spend at least the next 2 decades. The Robert Leeming case officially closed on November 2nd, 2021, with his sentencing for the murders of Jasmine Lovett and Aliyah Sanderson. But for those of us who worked the investigation, the case would never truly be closed. The images of that shallow grave in the Kananaskis wilderness, the sound of Robert's voice calmly describing the murders, and the grief of the victims' families would remain with us forever. In the months following the trial, I found myself reflecting on the lessons learned from this investigation. The case had highlighted the importance of persistence in the face of limited physical evidence, the value of innovative investigative techniques like Operation Highwood, and the critical role that behavioral analysis plays in understanding and apprehending violent criminals. But perhaps most importantly, the case had reminded me why I became a police officer in the first place. Despite all the darkness and violence that we encounter in this profession, there is still the possibility of justice, of holding evil accountable, and of providing some measure of closure to the families of victims. The investigation had also revealed significant failures in the system that had allowed Robert Leeming to continue his pattern of violence for so many years. His history of domestic abuse, animal cruelty, and threats have been documented by multiple agencies. yet he had never faced serious consequences for his actions.
Do you have
Sarah
a contact
Thompson,
number that you'd be
his
willing to give
ex-wife,
us?
had endured years of abuse and had provided detailed documentation of his violent behavior.
Nothing.
Are you
Yet
trying to get back
Robert
in?
had still been able to maintain his freedom
Oh.
and
That
continue
would tell
seeking
you
new
what?
victims and building ranks.
Yeah.
Right.
The system failed Jasmine
So,
and
yeah,
Aliyah
curious
long
on
before
what
Robert
see what's
killed
going
her.
on.
Sarah told
Okay.
me during one of our post-trial
All right. So where are you
if
planning
his
to go?
previous behavior
I
had
have
been
no
taken
one.
seriously,
I am here
if
on
there
my
had been
own.
real consequences for his
have
abuse,
nobody else.
maybe
I
they
have-
would still be alive today. This
If they don't want me
observation
in
led
tonight,
to
I
several
have nowhere to
policy
sleep.
changes within the Calgary
So,
Police
couldn't help
Service
you.
and the broader Alberta justice system.
What's going
New
on?
protocols were implemented for tracking
And so, but so
individuals with
the
histories of
Mercedes
domestic
SUV that they
violence.
took,
And
that's
additional
yours?
resources were allocated to
Yeah.
investigating
Okay.
threats
Did they tow
against
it?
intimate partners.
It's
Yeah, it's
gone.
gone.
The case
Yeah.
also highlighted the dangers of
More than I
online
know.
dating, particularly for vulnerable individuals
I'd
like
be
single
able to
mothers who
probably
may
get
be
back into
targeted by predators.
Okay.
Jasmine
But,
Lovett had taken reasonable
like I said,
precautions when
I-
meeting Robert, but she
was
had
hanging
no
out
way
at
of
the
knowing
Berwick,
about his
waiting
history
for
of
them to,
violence because he had carefully
be back in.
concealed it. Educational programs
what
were
time that's
developed
gonna be.
to help people
Okay, and there's no-
recognize
there's no
warning
way you wanna
signs
talk to us
of
on camera at all?
potentially dangerous partners. And
Probably
dating app companies were
not right
encouraged
now,
to
just in
implement
case,
better
you
screening
know.
procedures
I don't wanna-
for their users. If I could speak to everyone in the world at the same time, I would say slow down and enjoy what you've accomplished at this point so far. Find your inner peace and stay humble instead of always thinking too much about what you don't have or where you want to be in life but aren't yet. And remember, everyone's on their own amazing journey. Embrace who you are, be loud and proud, and remain positive. You're doing awesome. Reading Jasmine's words, written 2 years before her death, provides a glimpse into the kind of person she was: optimistic, thoughtful, and focused on building a positive life for herself and her daughter. Her message of self-acceptance and perseverance stands in stark contrast to the selfishness and violence that ultimately claimed her life. The investigation into her murder had consumed nearly 3 years of my life, but it had also provided me with a renewed sense of purpose. Every hour spent reviewing evidence, every interview conducted, every piece of the puzzle that we managed to fit together have been worth it to ensure that Robert Leeming would never have the opportunity to hurt another family. As I write this account, Robert Leeming has been in prison for over 2 years. He has continued to maintain his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He has filed multiple appeals, all of which have been unsuccessful, and he has attempted to generate media attention for his case by claiming that he was framed by corrupt police officers. These efforts have been largely ignored by the media and the public, who recognize them for what they are: the desperate attempts of a convicted killer to avoid responsibility for his crimes. Meanwhile, the families of Jasmine Lovett and Aliyah Sanderson continue to grieve their losses while trying to rebuild their lives. Kim Lovett has become an advocate for victims of domestic violence, speaking at conferences and supporting other families who have experienced similar tragedies. "I can't bring Jasmine and Aliyah back," she told me recently, "but I could try to prevent other families from going through what we've been through. If sharing our story helps save even one life, then maybe some good can come from this terrible situation." The case of Robert Leeming serves as a reminder that evil exists in the world, often hiding behind a facade of normalcy and respectability. But it also demonstrates that justice is possible, that dedicated investigation can uncover the truth, and that those who commit the most heinous crimes will ultimately be held accountable for their actions. For me, the case represents both the worst and best aspects of human nature: the capacity for unspeakable cruelty and the determination to seek justice for the innocent. It has strengthened my resolve to continue fighting for victims and their families, no matter how challenging the case or how long the investigation takes. The memory of Jasmine and Aliyah will remain with me for the rest of my career and beyond. Their lives were cut short by a man who valued his own convenience more than their safety, but their story will continue to serve as a powerful reminder of why the work we do matters. Justice for Jasmine Lovett and Aliyah Sanderson was not quick, and it was not easy, but it was complete, and it was final. Robert Leeming will spend the rest of his life in prison, where he belongs, and the world is a safer place because of it. In the end, that knowledge provides the only comfort possible in a case like this. We cannot bring back the dead, but we can ensure that their killers face the full consequences of their actions. We cannot undo the past, but we can work to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The investigation of Robert Leeming taught me that persistence, thoroughness, and innovation in police work can overcome even the most challenging obstacles. It reinforced my belief that every victim deserves justice, regardless of their circumstances or background. And it reminded me that the pursuit of truth, no matter how dark or difficult, is always worthwhile. As I close this account of the Leeming investigation, I want to acknowledge all of the professionals who contributed to this successful prosecution: the forensic specialists, the undercover officers, the prosecutors, and the many others who worked tirelessly to ensure that justice was served. I also want to remember Jasmine Lovett and Aliyah Sanderson, not as victims of a brutal crime, but as individuals who deserve to live full and happy lives. Their deaths were a tragedy that touched everyone who knew them, and their memory will continue to inspire those of us who work to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. The case is closed, but the lessons learned will endure. The system that failed to protect Jasmine and Aliyah has been improved, and future victims may be spared similar fates as a result. That knowledge provides some measure of meaning to their deaths and some hope for the future. Robert Leeming may have thought he was smarter than the police, more clever than the justice system, and capable of getting away with murder. He was wrong on all counts. The truth has a way of emerging, no matter how carefully it is concealed, and those who commit crimes against the innocent will ultimately face the consequences of their actions. This is the story of how 2 innocent lives were lost and how justice was ultimately served. It is a story of tragedy and triumph, of evil and good, of loss and redemption. It is a story that reminds us why the fight for justice must continue, no matter how difficult or how long it takes. The investigation is complete. The case is closed. Justice has been served. But the memory of Jasmine Lovett and Aliyah Sanderson will live on, and their story will continue to inspire those of us who work to protect the innocent and ensure that those who commit crimes against them are held accountable for their actions. May they rest in peace, and may their families find some measure of comfort in the knowledge that their killer will never again have the opportunity to hurt another family.